April 1945. Southern Germany, outside the small town of Landsberg. The world was screaming. The Third Army was advancing with a speed that defied the physical reality of a European spring. German resistance was collapsing like a house of cards in a gale. Towns were surrendering every day, white sheets hanging from windows that had previously bristled with rifles. General George S. Patton Jr. was driving through a newly liberated area, his eyes scanning the horizon, always calculating the next move, the next mile, the next victory. His jeep passed a makeshift prisoner holding area, a patch of dirt enclosed by hastily strung wire. Patton looked, then told the driver to stop. He got out and walked closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. Something was wrong. There were American soldiers behind the wire, not German prisoners. It was a German POW camp for Americans that hadn't been officially liberated yet. Standing at the gate was a guard in a German uniform, rifle at the ready. As Patton approached, the guard raised his weapon, pointing it directly at the general's chest. "Halt!" the guard shouted. The voice was high-pitched, vibrating with a terror that hadn't yet turned into iron. Patton stopped and looked. This wasn't a man. It was a boy. The guard was maybe 14 years old, perhaps 15. He was a child in a uniform 3 sizes too large. The steel helmet slid down over his eyes, and a swastika armband sat awkwardly on a thin arm that hadn't yet finished growing. The rifle in his hands looked impossibly heavy, yet the muzzle was level, and the boy's finger was on the trigger. Behind the wire, 40 American soldiers watched. They were ragged, thin, and silent, witnessing their legendary commander face a child with a gun. Patton had faced the best of the Wehrmacht, but he had never faced this. He raised his hand slowly, showing he wasn't reaching for his famous ivory-handled revolvers. He spoke in German. "Wie alt bist du? How old are you?" The boy's rifle wavered. He hadn't expected the general to speak his tongue. "Wir sind," he whispered, 14. Patton nodded. "Wo ist deine Mutter? Where is your mother?" The boy's face cracked. The mask of the soldier began to peel away. "Tot, dead. Dein Vater. Auch tot, also dead." Patton looked at him, a 14-year-old orphan in a dying empire, left behind to guard prisoners because the adults had run. Patton's driver and the soldiers behind him had their weapons ready. They could have ended the boy in a heartbeat. He was the enemy. He was a threat. But Patton raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. "Der Krieg ist vorbei," Patton said. "The war is over." The boy shook his head, tears finally welling up. "Nein, ich habe Befehl." "No, I have orders." "Befehl von wem?" "Orders from whom?" The boy hesitated. "Mein Kommandant." "Wo ist er?" The boy didn't answer. He didn't have to. The commander was gone, likely miles away, leaving a child to play the role of the martyr. Patton looked at the 40 Americans behind the wire. He looked back at the boy. "Listen to me. Deutschland hat verloren. The war is over. Your orders mean nothing anymore." The boy was crying now, but he didn't lower the rifle. "Ich bin ein Soldat," he insisted. Patton shook his head. "Nein, du bist ein Kind." "No, you are a child." Those words seemed to break the last of the boy's indoctrination. The rifle lowered slightly. Patton took another step forward. "Go home, Klaus." "Ich habe kein Zuhause. I have no home." "Then go to someone who knows you, an uncle, an aunt, someone." Patton reached out slowly and placed his hand on the barrel of the rifle, gently pushing it toward the earth. The boy let him. The weight of the weapon seemed to transfer from the child to the general. Patton held out his other hand. "Gib es mir." "Give it to me." The boy handed over the rifle. Patton passed it to his driver. The boy stood there, unarmed, weeping in his oversized uniform. Patton knelt down so he was eye level with him. "Der Krieg ist vorbei, Klaus. Dein Krieg ist vorbei." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. Klaus took it, looking at it as if it were a relic from another world. "Go now," Patton said. You go home, you tell no one you were here, you forget this uniform. You go to school, you have a life. Klaus took off his helmet and dropped it. He unbuttoned the heavy jacket, letting it fall into the mud. Underneath, he wore a civilian shirt, torn and dirty. He looked like a boy again. He nodded once, turned, and ran down the road until he was a small speck against the Bavarian hills. One of Patton's soldiers spoke up. "Sir, should we go after him? He's the enemy." Patton watched the road where the boy had disappeared. "He's 14 years old. His war is over." He turned to the gate. "Open it." American soldiers cut the lock. The 40 prisoners emerged, blinking in the sunlight. A sergeant walked up to Patton. "Sir, we've been here 3 weeks. That boy, he wasn't cruel. He shared his food when he had it. A few days ago, one of our guys got sick. The boy ran to town and brought back a doctor. He probably saved the man's life." Patton absorbed the information. A child trying to do his duty while desperately trying to remain human. He looked at the sergeant. "Do you think I did the right thing letting him go?" The sergeant looked down the road. "Yes, sir, I do." As they drove away later, Patton's driver asked, "That was the first time I've seen you let a German go, sir." Patton looked out at the ruins of the country. "That wasn't a German. That was a child who had no choice. I gave him a chance. That's more than Hitler gave him." Patton died months later, never knowing what became of Klaus. But years later, a letter arrived at 3rd Army headquarters. It was from a man named Klaus Schmidt. "I was the boy at Landsberg," the letter read. "I want you to know I made it. I found my uncle. I went to school. I became a teacher. I have a family now, 3 children. I think about that day often. The American general who called me a child, not a soldier. He gave me my life back. Tell him, if you can, that I became something better than a boy with a rifle." The letter was placed in the records, a testament to a day in April 1945, when a man of war decided that some enemies were worth saving. The landscape of Germany in 1945 was a surreal tapestry of destruction and strange, lingering beauty. As Patton's jeep moved away from the makeshift camp at Landsberg, the reality of the situation began to settle into the minds of the men traveling with him. The road was lined with the debris of a retreating army, overturned carts, charred remains of half-tracks, and the discarded helmets of soldiers who had realized the futility of their cause long before the boys of the Hitler Youth had. Patton remained silent for a long stretch of the drive. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, but his mind was clearly back at that gate, to his men. Patton was a force of nature, a commander who demanded perfection and ruthlessness. But the incident with Klaus revealed a layer of the man that was often buried under layers of starch and steel. The Third Army was not just a military force, it was an administrative machine. As they moved through Bavaria, Patton was responsible for more than just clearing out pockets of resistance. He was managing a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. Millions were displaced, the displaced persons or DPs, and among them were thousands of children just like Klaus. In the weeks following the encounter at Landsberg, Patton's order to his men became a point of contention within the ranks. He had made it clear, if they are children, we treat them as children. But the definition of a child was blurred by the reality of the Hitler Youth. These were boys trained in the art of the guerrilla, taught that dying for the Führer was the highest honor. Some of Patton's officers argued that by letting boys like Klaus go, they were seeding the ground for a future insurgency. They cited reports of werewolf units, clandestine groups of young Germans trained to strike from the shadows after the formal surrender. To a battle-hardened colonel who had lost half his regiment in the Ardennes, a 14-year-old with a rifle was still a shooter. Yet Patton held his ground. He understood something that many of his more rigid contemporaries didn't, that the only way to truly defeat an ideology is to offer an alternative that is demonstrably more human. By handing Klaus a chocolate bar instead of a bullet, he wasn't just being merciful, he was being strategic. He was breaking the cycle of indoctrination that had fueled the German war machine for a decade. The prisoners who had been liberated from that camp, the 40 American soldiers, became the most vocal supporters of Patton's decision. They stayed with the Third Army for a few days before being processed for their return home. During that time, they shared stories of their captivity. They spoke of how Klaus would sneak them extra scraps of bread, how he would listen to their stories of home with a curious, longing look in his eyes. One of the soldiers, a corporal from Ohio, recalled a night when Klaus had sat near the wire, away from the prying eyes of his superiors, and asked about New York. The boy had been told that American cities were dens of chaos and sin, but the corporal described a place of lights, music, and families. Klaus had listened in silence, his young mind trying to reconcile the propaganda he had been fed with the humanity of the men he was supposed to hate. This human connection was what Patton had tapped into. He knew that the war was won on the battlefield, but the peace would be won in the hearts of the survivors. If the Americans acted as the monsters Goebbels claimed they were, the war would never truly end. It would simply go dormant, waiting for the next generation to pick up the rifle. As April bled into May, the formal surrender of Germany drew closer. The Third Army found itself in a landscape of ghost towns. In many places, the only inhabitants left were the very old and the very young. Patton's jeep often passed through villages where children would emerge from the rubble, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Patton began to carry more than just chocolate. He instructed his supply officers to set aside portions of their rations, crackers, powdered milk, tinned meats, to be distributed to the civilian populations they encountered, specifically targeting children. It wasn't an official policy from SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. But in Patton's sector, it was the law. His soldiers, initially resistant, began to see the logic. They saw the faces of the children change when they realized the Americans weren't there to execute them. They saw the tension leave the small shoulders of boys who had been told they were the last line of defense for a master race that had abandoned them. The story of the boy at the gate began to circulate throughout the Third Army and then beyond. It became a symbol of the moral complexity of the occupation. It asked a question that every soldier had to answer for himself. At what point does an enemy stop being an enemy and start being a person? For Patton, that line was drawn at the age of 14. He saw in Klaus the victimhood of a generation. These children had been robbed of their innocence, their families, and their futures by a regime that saw them as expendable assets. By refusing to treat Klaus as a prisoner of war, Patton was giving him back his identity as a human being. The logistical challenge of feeding and sheltering the millions of refugees in Bavaria was staggering. Patton worked tirelessly, often clashing with his superiors over the allocation of resources. He was accused of being too soft on the Germans, of forgetting the atrocities that had been committed. But Patton's response was always the same: we are not them. He visited the hospitals where German children were being treated alongside American wounded. He spoke to the nurses, German and American alike, about the need for compassion. He understood that the wounds of war were not just physical, they were psychological and spiritual. The reconstruction of Germany had to start with the children. In the final days before the surrender, Patton found himself in a small Bavarian church. It was one of the few buildings in the area that hadn't been touched by the fighting. He sat in the back, away from the eyes of his aides, and watched as a group of local children practiced a hymn. They were thin, their clothes were rags, but their voices were clear. He thought of Klaus. He wondered if the boy had found his uncle, if he was safe. He realized that for all his medals and his fame, the act of letting that boy go might be the most significant thing he did in the entire war. It was a victory over the darkness that war brings to the soul. When the war finally ended on May 8, 1945, the celebrations were muted in the Third Army sector. There was too much work to do. The occupation was a grueling task of rebuilding roads, restoring power, and ensuring that the population didn't starve during the coming winter. Patton was at the center of it all, a warrior trying to navigate the peace. His tenure as the military governor of Bavaria was controversial. He was criticized for his views on denazification and his confrontational attitude toward the Soviet Union. But among the common people of Bavaria, especially the families who had seen their children return to them, there was a quiet respect for the general who had shown a flash of mercy in the middle of a storm of fire. The letter from Klaus Schmidt, arriving years later, was a validation of everything Patton had felt in that moment at the gate. Klaus didn't just survive, he thrived. He became a teacher, passing on the lessons of history and humanity to a new generation of Germans. He became a father, raising children who would never know the weight of a rifle at 14. Klaus's letter detailed his journey after he ran down that road. He had walked for days, avoiding the main roads, sleeping in haystacks. He eventually found his uncle's farm, a small plot of land that had survived the war. His uncle had been a veteran of the First World War and understood the shell-shocked look in the boy's eyes. They worked the land together, slowly rebuilding a life from the ashes. Klaus wrote about the chocolate bar Patton had given him. He hadn't eaten it all at once. He had saved small pieces of it, savoring the taste of a world that was no longer at war. It was, to him, the taste of freedom. It was the moment he realized that he didn't have to be a soldier anymore. He could just be Klaus. The impact of Patton's decision echoed through the decades. It served as a reminder that even in the most brutal conflicts, the individual choice to be kind can have a ripple effect that changes lives in ways we can't imagine. Patton gave Klaus a second chance, and Klaus spent his life honoring that gift. The story of the boy at the gate is a vital part of the Patton legend. It balances the image of the blood and guts commander with the reality of a man who was deeply aware of the human cost of war. It shows a leader who was willing to risk the disapproval of his own men and the criticism of his superiors to do what he believed was right. In the end, the history of World War II is not just a history of maps and movements, of generals and grand strategies. It is a history of moments, small, quiet moments where the course of a life is changed by a single act of grace. The moment at the gate in Landsberg was one of those moments. As the decades passed and the veterans of that war grew fewer, the story of Klaus and Patton remained a touchstone for those who study the morality of combat. It challenges the notion that war is a binary struggle between good and evil, showing instead a world of grays where the most courageous act is often the act of putting down the gun. Klaus Schmidt's children grew up in a Germany that was a leader in peace and industry. They learned about the war not as a glorious struggle, but as a cautionary tale. And they knew the story of the American general who had spoken to their father in German, who had seen a child instead of an enemy, and who had given him the chance to become a teacher. Patton's legacy is complex, filled with brilliance and flaws. But on that April day in 1945, he was at his absolute best. He didn't just liberate a camp, he liberated a soul. He didn't just win a battle, he helped win the peace. And in the quiet of a Bavarian schoolhouse years later, a man named Klaus would look out at his students and remember the day he was allowed to go home. The 40 American soldiers who were freed that day went back to their lives in cities and towns across the United States. They took with them the memory of the boy who had guarded them and the general who had set him free. They told the story to their own children and grandchildren, a story of how, even in the middle of a world-ending war, humanity could still find a way to break through. They remembered the sight of the boy running down the road, shedding the heavy skin of the Nazi uniform, and they remembered Patton standing there, watching him go. It was a sight that stayed with them longer than any battle, a moment of pure, unadulterated hope in a landscape of despair. The world changed after 1945, but the fundamental question of that day remains. How do we treat those we have defeated? Patton's answer was simple, direct, and profoundly difficult. He chose to see the potential for a future in the eyes of his enemy. He chose to believe that a 14-year-old was worth more as a citizen than as a casualty. And so, the story of the boy at the gate survives. It survives in the records of the Third Army, in the letters of a German schoolteacher, and in the collective memory of a generation that saw the worst of humanity and still found a reason to believe in the best. It is a story of a chocolate bar, a dropped rifle, and a second chance that was never wasted. George S. Patton Jr. was a man of many contradictions, but in the ruins of Landsberg he found a clarity that only comes from the heart. He saw a boy, he saw a gun, and he chose the boy. In doing so, he reminded the world that even the greatest warriors must eventually become the keepers of the peace. The war was over for Klaus, but the life Patton gave back to him was just beginning. And that life, in all its quiet, productive dignity, became the ultimate victory of the American Third Army. As we look back at the history of the 20th century, we see the giants who moved nations and shifted borders. But we must also look for the small figures in the margins, the boys in oversized helmets and the generals who knelt to meet their eyes. It is in those margins that the true history of the human spirit is written. Klaus Schmidt passed away a long time ago, a beloved figure in his community, a man who had dedicated his life to education and peace. He never forgot the face of the man who saved him. He never forgot the sound of the words, Der Krieg ist vorbei. And he never forgot the taste of the chocolate that represented the beginning of his real life. The road from Landsberg led to many places, to the reconstruction of Europe, to the Cold War, to the modern world we inhabit today. But for one boy, that road led home. And it led there because a man named Patton decided that the one order he wouldn't give that day was the order to fire. Instead, he gave the order to live. And that made all the difference. The legacy of that moment is not found in a museum or a history book, but in the lives of every student Klaus Schmidt taught, in every child his children raised, and in every act of mercy that has been inspired by the story of the general and the boy. It is a legacy of peace, born in the middle of war, and it is the most enduring victory George Patton ever won. In the final accounting of the Great Crusade, when the tanks are silent and the armies have gone home, it is the acts of humanity that remain. The story of Klaus and Patton is a beacon, a reminder that even in our darkest hours, we have the power to choose light. It is a story that will be told as long as people value mercy over vengeance and the future over the past. The jeep drove on, disappearing into the dust of the Bavarian road, leaving behind a boy who was no longer a soldier and a gate that was no longer locked. The war was ending, and for the first time in a long time, the air in Landsberg didn't just smell like smoke. It smelled like the possibility of a new day. Patton's choice at Landsberg remains one of the most profound examples of leadership in modern history. It wasn't about tactics. It was about the moral courage to see the humanity in the enemy. It was about the realization that every child saved from the fire of war is a brick in the foundation of a lasting peace. As the sun set over Germany in April 1945, the shadows of the past were long, but the light of the future was beginning to break through. And in that light, a boy named Klaus walked away from the war, carrying a chocolate bar and the promise of a life that he would spend the next 60 years making worthy of the chance he had been given. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of World War II.